Hello, everyone. I'm Judyth Sachs, and I'm the Chief Academic Officer for Studiosity. I'd like to welcome you to the second webinar series, and it's titled Creating a Comprehensive Student Support Ecosystem. I wish to acknowledge the traditional owners on the land in which I stand. I acknowledge the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation and pay my respects to elders past and present. Last week's webinar, presented by Denise Kirkpatrick, was highly engaging, and today's will be equally so. How quickly life is changing. This week, most students in Australian schools are returning to school. It is possible to go out and have dinner with 10 people, and we are still socially distancing. Today, we are traversing the country and travelling to Western Australia to Edith Cowan University, where we will learn about ECU's integrated student support ecosystem, which intentionally aligns the institutional agenda for student support across 6 layers of operations: strategic planning, policy, personnel, programs, practices, and third-party partners. We joked earlier in the week about how much we liked alliteration and the power of the plosive P. We welcome new participants and thank those returning and being here today. Studiosity is an agile and flexible organisation, and we believed it was important to connect with our partners and other interested groups to continue the conversations about supporting students first. Our response is a suite of webinars over the next few months. The approach will also ensure a more inclusive level of participation. It's more economical to spend an hour on Zoom than flying across the country. We've heard many times now the personal and economic impact of the COVID-19 pandemic. We're all literally invited into people's homes, accidentally introduced to pets and children, and possibly we've become more sedentary. On a positive note, the pandemic has demonstrated that as a sector, we can respond quickly and that our institutions' commitment to student learning is central. That courses were put online so quickly has surprised many of us. We are learning by doing and improving as we go along. It's interesting, some universities are continuing to teach remotely until the end of the year as a risk mitigation strategy in case of a possible spike. Other institutions are giving people the choice of either to work at home or to come on campus. Either way, how we work and where we work has certainly been tested. Now to introduce you to our 2 speakers, Professor Angela Hill and Professor Rowena Harper. Angela Hill is DVC Education at Edith Cowan. Her portfolio responsibilities include the Centre for Learning and Teaching, the Library Services Centre, and the Directorate of Student Life. Professor Hill has key responsibilities for ECU's Technology Enhanced Learning Strategy, academic governance, and textile regulatory activities. Clearly, she's the right person to be talking to us today. Her colleague is equally eminent. Rowena joined ECU in July 2019 as Director of the Centre for Teaching and Learning. Prior to this, she held a number of appointments at UniSA, including Head of Language and Literacy in the Teaching Innovation Unit and Acting Associate Director of Curriculum Development and Support, also in the Teaching Innovation Unit. She is an expert in the area of academic integrity. The work that she's doing for the Australian government and her invitations to work overseas and provide contributions to academic integrity are impressive. So without further ado, let me invite our 2 presenters to talk to us about their institution.
Thanks very much, Judyth, and thank you to Studiosity for the invitation and the opportunity to share our practice and also to learn from colleagues nationally. I guess it's appropriate for us to first of all acknowledge that it is a really difficult period, and I do hope that everyone is doing okay, however they're managing through the COVID-19 situation. Another P word, Judyth, pandemic, that we have. As I begin, and especially as it's National Reconciliation Week, it's really vital that we reflect on our actions that foster meaningful engagement with our communities. In Western Australia, we are working in the traditional country of the Noongar people that cover the entire southwestern portion of Western Australia. I would like to acknowledge the traditional owners here and wherever you are located and pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. At each of our 3 Western Australian campuses, and you can see the map on your screen hopefully, Joondalup, our campus in the north of Perth, our largest campus, Mount Lawley in central Perth, and Bunbury in the southwest, just near Margaret River, we have designed reflection spaces in collaboration with Indigenous community members. The space on your screen is located at our Bunbury campus and designed to reflect both the natural and cultural elements of the Bunbury region and the Wadani Noongar people. The space is called Dambat Bilya, which means 3 rivers, as the design of the space symbolises the meeting of the Brunswick, Collie and Preston rivers into Bunbury's Kumbana Bay. The 6 Noongar seasons, and we're just about starting in the wettest season, the 2 months that are the wettest in Perth, and it's certainly showing that today, are represented by the 6 timber poles made from the main tree species of the region, the Jarrah, Tuart and Marri. Also featured in the space are an overhead shade and fire pit, which have been designed to reflect significant constellations in the Milky Way. For those of you who have heard me speak before, I don't miss an opportunity to say a bit about Edith Cowan University's history. I've been here since 2017, and as the reflection spaces I have outlined suggest, Edith Cowan is an institution deeply committed to social justice and the transformative power of education. This should not be surprising given the institution's history and its name. I'm sure many of you have noted that ECU is indeed the only Australian university named after a woman. Edith Cowan was, of course, the first woman elected to any Australian parliament, a dedicated advocate for public education and women, and among other things, a campaigner for support of women experiencing domestic violence. It is also the quiet achiever in terms of the student experience. The Good University Guide recognises ECU's excellence in student support and, amongst other areas, teaching quality. For 13 years in a row now, we've been ranked the top university for teaching quality, the top public university for teaching quality. This is quite an achievement. It was certainly daunting when I commenced here, and this now coincides with our rapidly improving research ranking. To round off the introduction, it will probably be useful to contextualise much of what Rowena will talk about in terms of our work in learning support to highlight a few of the key facts of the university. ECU is a medium-sized university with around 30,000 students, including international students from over 100 countries. We have 8 schools, including the famous Western Australian Academy of Performing Arts, WAPA, that claims graduates such as Hugh Jackman and Tim Minchin. Importantly for our student services, it is worth noting that around 25% of our students study entirely online. It's one of the reasons we've been able to be quite agile in the COVID crisis, as we already had significant capability for delivering online. We celebrate a very diverse cohort of students, with 48% of our cohort the first in family to attend university, and a predominantly female identifying cohort with the average age of 26. So we do celebrate this very diverse cohort of students. So given the university's history and what I've outlined, it's probably not surprising to note that ECU is a very values-led institution. I'd like to reflect a little on what this means. A values-based organisation has a culture shaped by a clear set of ground rules, which are the basis and guiding principles for decision-making and actions. There is a strong alignment between personal values and the organisation's values. While it may sound a little like rhetoric, the leadership sets examples for the organisation and lives the values they espouse. ECU's strategic plan, authored by the current VC, Steve Chapman, continues the tradition of the 2 former VCs, founded on its values. It's worth noting, I think, that staff satisfaction at ECU is astonishingly high, including feedback we've just received on a survey across the university about how we're handling COVID-19. There is a deep belief in the organisation and the institution, and as we will describe, a strong integration of values, plans, and practice. Today, Rowena and I are going to focus on how the values framework creates a foundation for the student experience. As I will outline in a minute, ECU has developed a series of intentionally focused whole of institution student experience plans to bring life to the overall institutional strategy. These plans have redesigned many student experience policies and are brought to life by personnel or people who have been intentionally recruited and display aligned values that support the student experience. A series of programs are designed and resourced through active partnerships with all stakeholders across the institution. For each program, our approach is designed and increasingly articulated to reflect our strength-based ideology. Finally, we are supported by a range of third-party partners to support the diverse needs of our cohorts. Our focus is to create impact on the success and ultimately the lives of students. Since 2017, we've collaboratively developed 3 whole of institution blueprints or roadmaps that articulate our approach, priorities and actions for the student experience. These documents set our intentional way forward. They were developed with consultation across the ECU community, including our key partners in service centres, academic schools, and of course with students. Our technology enhanced learning blueprint focuses on our commitment to ensuring students experience the very best learning, enabled by contemporary learning technologies. The Student Success Blueprint describes the coordinated approach to improving student outcomes, and the Equity, Diversity and Inclusion Blueprint, led by my fabulous colleague, the Pro-Vice Chancellor Braden Hill, no relation, who focuses the institutions on our aspirations to be a sector leader in inclusive practice. For our presentation today, the focus is the Student Success Blueprint. This plan focuses a strength-based approach to student success, challenging the institution to interrogate the ways in which success is fostered and embodied. We have 5 articulated priorities that echo our overall partnership approach. Each priority has a number of strategies that various parts of the institution take accountability for. Progress against the blueprint is reported to the university's governing bodies annually. I don't want to gloss over the term strength-based. At ECU, we acknowledge we are immersed in solving a wicked problem of student success. Wicked in terms of the challenges of working with a highly diverse group of students, many of whom, as I've described, are first in family. But additionally, we are navigating very restrictive funding from government in terms of accessing support for this diverse cohort. A discourse founded in strength-based approaches helps us challenge simple solutions and encourage us to invest in the inherent strengths of our students and staff, and importantly, normalise help-seeking behaviour. While TEXA is clear about the place of policy in academic governance, as equity-oriented scholars, we argue that policy should be used as a way of marshalling ideas and resources to shape institutional practice and programs. Over the last 3 years, we have systematically reviewed all our key academic and student-oriented policies, including curriculum approval, design, assessment policies, our approach to academic integrity, as well as our approach to admissions, and more recently, mental health. I hope that our approach has directed our student policies to focus on our aspirational outcomes. One example of this policy and program nexus is the curriculum review policy that focuses our attention each year on units with high fail rates. The policy requires us to harness evidence and systematically engage with data for each unit. We then examine teaching quality and curriculum design in each unit through a targeted program coordinated by the Centre for Learning and Teaching. This high fail unit program is just one example of that policy program integration, with each action embedded as a policy requirement. To create sustained changes in any ecosystem, sustained efforts are required over multiple sites. We've established networks that link key stakeholders together. I lead, for example, the Student Advising Leadership Group, where areas within and outside my portfolio map challenges, allocate resources, design solutions, and review data. We meet every 3 weeks. Our transition team, led by our Director of Student Life, is another example of this networked approach. We also have a health and wellbeing network and an employability network, and of course a key learning and teaching leadership network. These diagrams indicate example ways that we harness the energy of the institution and the expert of our people. The purple indicating our student workforce, for example here, are harnessed through these intentional partnerships. To map the success of this ecosystem, we've adopted a logic model of evaluation with an increasingly sophisticated approach to evaluating impact. We focus on some of the core evaluation questions, as you see on your screen. We are particularly interested in the usage of the programs at the moment and how we are normalising this help-seeking behaviour. We are always very clear in our analysis that we are mapping to fundamentally look at who's benefiting, who's absent, how can we improve this program? And we're very clear that our impact measures point us to correlation, but never causation. We're not at a sufficiently sophisticated level of evaluation to be able to attribute any particular program to causation at this point. I'm going to finish off by noting that TEXA acknowledged in our recent re-registration that this focus was indeed working. And I'm going to hand over now to Rowena to talk more particularly about the ecosystem and how it works in relation to learning support.
Thanks, Angela. So I'll just check you can all hear me now that I've turned my mic back on. I think I'm seeing nodding, great. As Judyth mentioned at the beginning, I joined DCU in July last year, and in addition to overseeing the learning support services, as you can see here, I also oversee the teaching quality team. So that's the team that supports academics in improving the quality of their teaching practice and their curriculum and assessment design, both on campus and online. And I also oversee our learning technologies and innovation team. So they support our primary learning technologies, including our learning management system and Turnitin in our text matching software. In addition to working at University of South Australia previously and the University of Canberra, I was also previously the president of the Association for Academic Language and Learning. And so during that time in my role in ALL, and I was in various roles within ALL for about 10 years, I saw lots of different approaches to learning support across the country. I really had the privilege of being able to get in quite close contact with managers of learning support across Australia and in New Zealand and overseas. And so I was able to see the range of ways that learning support services were positioned within organisations and the way that they were deployed within universities. And I don't think I've seen a more integrated approach to learning support than I've been experiencing at DCU since I arrived. So this is what I'm going to talk you through today. Next slide, thanks Angela. So we're doing a tag team here, highly socially distanced. Angela's in her office and I'm in mine, so I'm signalling her for slide changes. So this slide really shows how in relation to learning support, our strategic plan then lays out the groundwork for the details that unfold around learning support into our student success blueprint, as Angela mentioned, and also our technology enhanced learning blueprint. So you can see there in our strategic plan, there are really 2 key actions that relate directly to the learning support area. One is around retention, a focus on retention and peer support. And this is probably not uncommon in strategic plans across Australian universities. The second item there, though, around communication development, I think that's probably less common in strategic plans of universities. And including a focus on language and language development, I think that's probably almost non-existent when you would look across strategic plans of Australian universities. So I think this, to me, signals that strong commitment ECU has to social justice and recognising that we've got a highly diverse cohort for whom language development and communication skills development, both academic and professional, are going to be really key measures in their success, both at university and beyond. And I think it's interesting to me that even when the higher education standards a number of years ago contained quite explicit requirements around English language, I still noticed as the president of all this was not making its way into university strategic plans, policies, etc. It was not necessarily well actioned because it's such a wicked problem. But at ECU, I'll show you how it's been really mapped out at all those layers of the ecosystem. So then from the strategic plan, we then map down to our student success blueprint, and we have that key statement there that Angela mentioned already, the aim to normalise the use of key student support services. And I'll highlight that again later when we look at the data, that this is a really key initiative for us at the moment when we look at uptake of our services, that it's mixed and uneven. And this is something we want to address. We also see there in the Student Success Blueprint this evidence-based approach to reviewing and enhancing courses and units, and an explicit requirement in that action that this will be done through partnership between academic staff, our unit and course coordinators, and key professional staff, including people across my unit, the CLT, student life, and elsewhere across the university. It really is a whole of institution approach to that unit and course review and enhancement. We've also got items there for the expanding student and peer-led study assistance programs, and also that explicit requirement then about embedding the development of oral and written communication in curriculum. And I think there are a lot of attendees here today who work in the learning support and learning advising space, and that bottom action is one that I know that field of professionals has been working towards for many years, and is a kind of a layer of work that we really aspire to in all our institutions. So next slide, thanks Angela. So we move now from that strategic planning layer down to policy. So this is where we start to get more detailed again about how this strategic agenda is implemented, is actioned within the university. So there are really two key policies that guide these strategic aims around learning support and embedding of communication. The first is our assessment policy and procedures. And you can see there, it unpacks even further that requirement that communication and generic skills will be embedded within key tasks, within key assessment tasks. And we also see then more explicitly that each course will use a range of assessment types that will assess both written and oral communication. This assessment policy is accompanied by a curriculum design policy and set of procedures. And again, we can see further detail around how curriculum will be developed in a collaborative environment. So that is that partnership between academic and professional staff. And that also communication skills will be contextualised and embedded. So rather than providing, which I think probably many learning advice professionals are used to, kind of providing sort of fairly generic communication skills development that gets kind of plopped in or plonked in or shoved in or wheeled in. We've used many kind of many analogies in the learning support field for years to describe that. Rather than putting that kind of generic communication skills development within a unit, there's this explicit statement here that it needs to be contextualised to the discipline, the professional area, and include things like teamwork and critical thinking, problem solving, etc. I think the other area where ECU is particularly strong in the sector is around English language development. That explicit strategic requirement for language development is then implemented through these detailed requirements for establishing entry and exit standards in all courses that are then identified through a diagnostic assessment. It's compulsory for all commencing students when they start. And then articulated exit standards around communication and language that we assess through milestone assessments throughout the course and key tasks, key learning activities throughout courses and units also. And you can see there at the end, if it wasn't already clear that we had to take a partnership approach, it explicitly says there that the Centre for Learning and Teaching will support teaching staff. So next slide there, thanks Angela. So moving on now then to how that gets implemented at the people level or the personnel level. Now, this is an overview of the staff within the learning support area within the CLT. So the orange blocks represent staff who are in my area in CLT, but the yellow blocks are areas that really contribute to learning support, but don't sit within my unit. So at the top there are senior learning advisors. They are school aligned, and we have one senior learning advisor in every school, each one of our 8 schools. We also have PASS. We run a PASS program, peer assisted study sessions in 30 units across the year. And we've got a PASS coordinator, Sharon Matthews, who coordinates our PASS program and our peer leaders also. We've got a team in addition of learning advisors. There are 7 learning advisors, and these include learning advisors with specialities in English additional language teaching and in STEM. And the learning advisor team provides those what we would call generic or general drop-ins, one-to-ones and workshops on things like study skills and academic literacies. So we also have peer advisors in VEEP. So these are students who are trained to work with students both online and on campus. And during COVID-19, we've developed VEEPs as a new service, providing sort of at-elbow guidance in helping students navigate the online environment, which has been particularly important for students who've never studied online before. We have a Pella advisor, so this is our staff member who supports the university in conducting Pella and also provides advice on our English language entry standards. And we have an academic integrity coordinator and HDR learning advisors who sit in learning support as well. So all up, we've got a team of 22 in our learning support team. And I think perhaps it's the most well-resourced learning support team in the sector per EFSL. And I think that for me is appropriate when you look at how integrated learning support is into the operations of the university, into our curriculum design, our assessment, and into our strategic aims. So I think also what you can see here is really clear designated responsibilities for leadership and ownership around these key areas for embedding, for learning support, for peer support and English language and Pella. You can see our staffing profile really aligns with what those strategic and policy goals are. Next one, thanks Angela. So this is a diagram that's probably familiar to many people who work in the field of learning advising. It outlines how we conceive of the various programs we run in the learning support area. So that it's, essentially degrees of embeddedness. So this indicates the supports we offer right from self-access resources. So these might be resources that are in hard copy or online that students can access as needed, through to general workshops or one-to-ones that our learning advisor team runs, our peer support programs, then the more specialised support generally provided by our senior learning advisors who focus on maybe curriculum advising, but also support for students who might have been identified at risk within a school or discipline area. And also then our embedded work around academic literacies and communication and language development in the curriculum. And, you know, this idea of embedding is the degrees of embeddedness, if you like. That really the understanding here is that the more embedded the practice, the closer to the curriculum, the more impactful for a larger number of students and the more impactful in terms of outcomes. So this is really the framework on which we base our provision of programs. So moving now from programs down to practice, I thought it might be useful to give you a sense of how we actually plan and coordinate the practice of learning support at ECU. So the things I'm going to show you preceded my arrival, and I was quite amazed actually at again the level of integration at every level between what learning advisors do on a daily basis, what the learning support team does on a daily basis with that strategic agenda. So our senior learning advisors create project plans and these will detail and map all the initiatives that they're planning to engage in with a school in a particular year. So these will be driven by data. So the plan will be established in consultation with the school, and it will target appropriate initiatives around our high fail rate units, for example, units where we have poor student satisfaction or poor retention. Or this example, units where we need to embed employability skills. I don't know how many of you are familiar with the national ranking table around student employment outcomes, but if you look towards the bottom of the table, you'll see Western Australian universities are overrepresented. So ECU has a really strong focus on employability this year. You'll also see that these plans assume that collaboration, and they will make a record of and note who the collaborators are to ensure that we're always taking that team approach, team approach between academic and professional staff. And they'll also then contain a link usually to output evidence. So this enables us to plan what we're doing, track what we're doing, and also report what we're doing annually, as Angela said, to those range of governance committees where we're able to report up how learning support's being provided. In addition to that, the learning support team also developed a set of guidelines for learning advice practice. And so these guidelines have been incredibly useful for inducting new learning advisors into the team when they commence, for continuous improvement and reflection, and also establishing some quality standards around how learning support's provided. And I think it's important to note that these guidelines were also actually provided to Studiosity as a partner, with that aim of ECU students getting that consistent and coherent experience across all the different forms of learning support that we offer. Next slide, Angela. Great. So now on to partners, and ECU works with a wide range of partners, and in the learning support area, these are really the key ones. So of course we work with Studiosity as a partner in the provision of 24/7 online advice, assessment advice and learning support. We also run the PASS program, as I said, and so while that's not necessarily a third-party partner, we see that as a really important partnership in terms of partnering with students around the provision of learning support. We also partner with an organisation called CADMAS. So CADMAS may be familiar to some of you who work in the field of academic integrity. CADMAS is an online platform in which students complete assignments that enables institutions to scaffold the development of academic literacies within the platform and provide resources and support in one place for students completing their assignments at university. And ECU focuses this platform around first year units mainly, to scaffold first year students, commencing students' development of assessment literacies. So I think again, you know, so identifying where in the sort of program provision that each of these programs and partners are actually sort of positioned. You can see, you know, Studiosity works similarly in terms of, similarly to our sort of more general learning support provision, but provides a sort of a 24/7 online version. PASS is working there at our peer support program level, and Cadmus is more embedded. Cadmus sits in the curriculum as a platform in which students do their assignments, and it's established in collaboration with unit coordinators in the assessment design process. So they sit at different levels and operate in different levels within that array of programs that we offer. So moving on now to impact, and I wanted to reiterate the point Angela made about, you know, the assessment of impact as a wicked problem. This is an extract from the ECU Retention and Success Report from 2019, and it indicates the reasons that have been cited by students for seriously considering ECU. And what I wanted to use this to highlight is the range of factors that impact on student success and student retention. And academic support is just one of these. So I think this helps highlight that when we're evaluating the impact of learning support or any form of academic support, it's impossible to confidently attribute that form of support to a student's success or retention of a student. There are simply too many variables. So that's really the reason, as Angela said, why we talk about correlation and not causation, that we're aiming to use data in a sophisticated way, aiming to understand the impact of support and not simply argue for, kind of simplistically, for its inherent value, if you like. So when it comes to the way we measure impact, we've got a broad suite of dashboards, of data dashboards available in Tableau, and Angela shared a screen grab of that on an earlier slide. And we use this array of data to report on all programs annually, primarily to Education Committee, but also to a range of other governance committees. And so you can see there, in terms of that primary question of who engaged with the service and who is absent, this is a really important measure for us in terms of identifying the extent to which we're normalising learning support. Are we getting representative access across all these student groups, you know, by campus, by school, by disability status, first in family, international, etc.? You know, are all these students engaging in similar rates with all of our learning support services or not? Then also, who benefited? So at the moment, we use two primary measures for analysing impact. One is that we compare the student success rates, we compare the pass rates of students who engaged with a learning support service and students who didn't. And I'll be showing you some data that's been analysed in that way shortly. And we also use weighted average marks to look at the extent of impact across the students who engaged and got a variety of marks. But we also want to understand, and this is a key focus area for me this year, we also want to understand what difference the program did make, and it's often not the difference that was originally intended. So sometimes certain forms of learning support provision are introduced in order to improve those big ticket indicators, to improve retention, to improve success. But what we often see, particularly in students' qualitative commentary around their use of learning support, is that learning support does other things. Learning support gives students an increased sense of belonging. Learning support makes students feel more confident. Learning support makes students feel reassured. And these things are not unimportant. These things also have value. So this goes towards that idea that we want to use our evaluation approaches to really understand in a nuanced way what it is that different forms of learning support provide for students. So this is a slide that indicates uptake. So this is essentially usage rates for all of our learning support, our generic learning support sessions. So they're those one-to-ones, general workshops, those forms of learning support, generally provided by our learning advice team. And you can see there that our uptake across those different school groups ranges from about 4.5% of students in science through to 18.2% of students in nursing and midwifery. And here, having looked at learning support data now for many years, I can see some really common patterns happening here. One of the things we typically see in learning support data is gendered norms. So we tend to see that learning support services are accessed far more by females than they are by males. And this, I think, is a result of gendered norms around help-seeking behaviour. It's not associated, help-seeking is not associated with traditional Australian masculinity. So it's not uncommon for learning support services to see more use in disciplines like nursing and midwifery and education, where there are simply more females enrolled, and not unusual to see lower rates of access in disciplines like science and engineering that are more male-dominated. So one of our aims in that is really to look at how we can better normalise the access of support for those cohorts that don't typically access it. This slide does that comparison I was speaking about earlier with comparing the pass rates of the students who attended a general learning support session versus those who did not. And you can see there the impact column is really the percentage difference in the pass rates from those who accessed versus those who didn't. And you can see that actually the areas in which that difference in pass rates is the largest are for engineering students. There you can see 9.9% for students studying online, and also for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander students. Now, I just wanted to pause on this data for a minute because I think it's interesting to me. Now, my reading of this data is that it doesn't mean that learning support per se is more impactful for these or in these areas. I think it's more an indicator that a student's self-efficacy is a more significant factor in a student's success in these particular areas and for these groups. So these figures, to me, I think they signal more about how our curriculum is serving these student groups, when an individual's self-efficacy seems to be a stronger determinant in their success. So this is something that I'm interested in exploring. I think this is more an indicator of those discipline areas and those student groupings rather than the impact of learning support on these particular cohorts, because self-efficacy is such an important underlying factor. Okay, next one. So onto our Studiosity data. So during COVID-19, we've actually expanded our Studiosity use to include all students. Normally, ECU's strategy around Studiosity is to target it towards certain cohorts of students for whom we want to provide that additional online support. During COVID-19, we've expanded it to all students. And so there you can see the typical cohort we would normally provide it to as about 20,000 students. And so far this year, about 1,100 students have accessed, and that's about 6% of that targeted cohort. And because we've expanded it during COVID-19 to all our students, that means the uptake rate's currently about 3.2% of those eligible students. Next slide. Now, in terms of the impact, we've done the same kind of analysis that we do with our other learning support services. And you can see the pass rate differences there between those who've accessed Studiosity and those who haven't are similar across the board, more similar across, around in the ballpark, around 6% for many of those student groups that you can see in the table. But there are some notable outliers. Again, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander students, but also school leaver students. And again, for me, this is perhaps an indicator that our curriculum isn't necessarily serving these student groups, scaffolding these student groups in the way that they would benefit from, perhaps in the way that it does for those other student groupings. So again, I think some really interesting questions can be asked about what this is telling us. So this is the impact of our PASS program. And I think, again, similar analysis, pass rates of those who've accessed PASS versus those who haven't. And one thing you might note is that across the board, the uptake is higher. Students access PASS more at higher rates than our other forms of learning support, the other two we've looked at so far. And I think for that reason, if you think back to that step diagram of our different forms of programs, the more embedded, degrees of embeddedness diagram, PASS is closer to the curriculum. It's always aligned to a unit. So I think for students, the perceived relevance of a PASS session is higher than something that's of a more general nature in terms of how it's offered. You can also see here that access rates are higher for certain cohorts, students who are mature aged, students with a disability, international onshore students, and also English speaking background students. Next slide. When it comes to impact of PASS, you can see that the impact is also higher across the board as well. So, up into the high teens and 20% difference between students who've attended a PASS and students who haven't. The biggest differences in PASS rates are for mature age students and internationals, but I think also interesting to note too that the difference is higher for English speaking background students more so than our non-English speaking background students. And I think this has helped us reflect on the need to train all of our PASS leaders in supporting non-English speaking background students. And indeed, we've also begun to employ students who speak English as a second language and students who are international, so that our leaders bring that lived experience to the work that they do and to the PASS leader group. So we're on to some reflections and conclusions now. So Angela may want to rejoin me at this point so we can offer some closing thoughts. So I think just an initial reflection from me is that I think that this highly integrated ecosystem where all the layers really work together, my observation during COVID-19 is that's really helped us be quite agile, in that the moment a decision was made about a strategic move we needed to make around our curriculum design, our assessment design, moving off campus in terms of our offerings, it was able to be actioned really quickly down the line at all layers, because the way we operate is so connected at all times. Angela, did you want to chime in here and add anything in terms of reflections?
No, I think Rowena, that I think the agility is true, but I think there's also to sustain the networked approach also requires a level of goodwill and confidence. And I think that having people being able to articulate how programs should operate, how policies present aspirations for the university, and how the plans focus our attention, it means that more quickly you can engage people in the work that we've needed to do in the last 3 years, but also in the recent times.
I think what this slide also speaks to towards the end is the our student cohorts are not getting less diverse, they're getting more diverse, and so are our educational offerings, our delivery modes, the locations we deliver in. And if we want to ensure that we keep providing each of our students with a higher quality experience, I think our data analysis just has to continue getting more sophisticated. I think we need to identify ways to engage in more multivariate analysis, identifying the multiple things that impact on student success. And so that's some ways off. so that our ecosystem can continue to really respond and support that student diversity in the way that it aims to.
We were going to finish off with a question, Judyth, and hand back to you, but maybe of interest to people to reflect on the extent to which their university's ecosystem speaks to each other, and we'd be very happy to respond to any other questions. And I'm going to stop sharing deliberately at this point so that we can take the questions. So thanks.
Thank you, Angela and Rowena. What you've certainly demonstrated to all of us is that Edith Cowan is the quiet achiever. You are doing remarkable work, but you are achieving substantial results. Can I ask a couple of questions before? There are a couple of people that have written questions as well. You talked about alignment and integration and as being absolutely fundamental to the ecosystem. And you attested it through COVIS, and it demonstrated that it was agile and responsive. Given that you've got multiple campuses, how can you make sure that in fact that alignment and integration is experienced in the same way across your 3 campuses?
Well, Judyth, I could talk about the multiple, let's call them meetings that have occurred. So we have a weekly meeting with our Sri Lanka campus partners to ensure that they're supported and that we understand the challenges that they face as they have a much stricter curfew than we've had. But I think that you have to set up those intentional networks and partnerships and have a willingness to engage in a trusting way, and particularly in the offshore mode, very mindful of a decolonisation lens, if you like, to make sure that you're approaching this with real reciprocity. But I guess constantly sweeping, and I know I find myself doing that, hopefully not at 3 a.m. in the morning, but constantly sweeping for who are you missing in the conversations, and what's the data telling you, what's the noise telling you from the inquiry line about what's not happening. So constantly linking back to the voices that you're hearing and those that might be absent. I don't know, Rowena, if you want to add anything.
Yeah, and I would add there, it's continuous work, and I think those non-metropolitan locations, I think, are a challenge at every institution, because there's that added kind of tyranny of distance. And as Angela said, it really is work. It's about that intentional setting up of those networks and connections, but also I think our willingness to hear the differential experiences at those locations and be able to incorporate that into what you do. It's not a one-size-fits-all approach. Certainly in terms of learning support, it can't be.
So the second question was about conditions that enabled it. You talked about meetings, you talked about building trust. You also indicated that you were very fortunate to have a very well supported and resourced student services unit. And in many universities, they're now starting to disestablish those units and put them into faculties. How have you managed the politics to ensure the success of this? Because I'm deeply impressed with both the scope, the scale, and the impact of what you've been doing.
Was that a question for me, Judyth?
If you'd like to answer it, happy for you to answer it.
Sure. Yeah, look, I think, probably no one, that few people are more aware than I of those issues that face learning support teams. When I was the president of all, I watched many learning support units be slowly diminished in size over time. As staff left, they weren't replaced. And so the learning support teams had to just sort of continually refigure their services in line with that. I think in my assessment of that, I suppose, is that I have not seen at any other institution an approach where learning support is so written into the strategic agenda that often I think learning support units are deployed as a set of people, but their work, their practice, the programs they run, the work that they do is not understood and valued and deployed at that strategic level in the same way that I have seen at ECU. And that's not to say we're alone in that, but I think we do it in a particularly robust way. And so it's understood then, I suppose, that a reduction in learning support would mean compromising the strategic plan. So that because they're connected in that inherent way. So I suppose that's why I think the resourcing, the resourcing for the learning support team here is sort of understood in that context.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that is relatively unique.
Mm-hmm.
And I guess one of our distinctive features, Judyth, is the teaching quality and the ratings for the student experience. And that is something the university is absolutely determined to hold on to. And I've actually heard our Vice-Chancellor say, if we're spending more money on student support activities and we have these outcomes, then that's the price we pay.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So it is about the leadership of the institution having a belief in the need for wide-ranging support and being determined to pursue that.
And that's a really important condition, isn't it? Yeah. So there's two questions. Do you compare across education backgrounds? Andrea Lynch asked that question, ATAR. So do you compare across educational background?
Rowena, I think when we look at the data, we have the ability to do that. We do look at that, but ATAR is a very small proportion of the student backgrounds that we have. Probably about 20% of our cohort come from an ATAR pathway. So we are probably more interested in, we do a lot of tracing of different kinds of pathways from our pathway colleges, from different entry backgrounds, from our university preparation program. So we do track that, but ATAR is a very small group, but educational background we certainly look at in terms of use of support services. But we certainly do have that data. I think we can pull that data as part of our analysis.
And the final question, it's for you, Andrea. No, sorry. It's for you, Rowena. Do you see the launch of answer platforms, for example, Chegg Course Hero in Australia, as a challenge to academic integrity?
Yeah, this is topical, Judyth. You've got no idea. Yes, they are. They are a challenge. They're not an insurmountable challenge, but they certainly are. The fact that it is now so easy for any student to outsource aspects of their assessment to somebody who's willing to complete it for a fee online, whether it's via Chegg or Gumtree or Airtasker or whatever platform. I think now it's really, universities really must take this seriously, and it's really part of our unit's role actually to raise unit coordinators' awareness of these platforms, the existence of these platforms and the kinds of help that students can get online, and ensure that they've got resources and advice available to redesign their curriculum and their assessment arrangements to diminish the likelihood that a student's going to utilise these platforms, and if they do, we'll detect it. So it's about looking at the whole teaching and learning ecosystem. Again, to come back to ecosystem, it's about looking at the whole teaching and learning ecosystem and how that prevents the use of these platforms, educates students in good academic practice, and then detects the use of these platforms if it does occur.
Okay, and look, just a very quick answer to the last question. Nash has thanked you very much for your presentation. Have you noticed either an uptake or a decrease in students accessing academic support services during COVID?
Angela might want to speak to some other forms of support, but in terms of learning support, I'm not sure that we've seen either a decrease or an increase. It's, I think interestingly, it feels to me like it's remained fairly steady. And I'm not sure yet what that means, but certainly we haven't seen an enormous spike in access to learning support.
Yeah. The shift that we have seen is an increase in attendance at counselling sessions. So a move to telehealth has actually meant that the cancellation rate for our counselling service has been much lower. Students turn up for a phone or a Skype telehealth counselling session consistently, as distinct from the face-to-face, and that's probably related to transport and other things that limit students actually attending counselling services. So we've seen also an increase in issues of domestic violence that have required additional support and different kinds of support than we've had in place previously. So we have seen a different kind of student support necessary and a different way of accessing some support services.
Okay.
And I'll add to that, if I may, that I was sent some data just yesterday on the different ways in which students were accessing learning support, and about 55% of our learning support sessions had been conducted online by video via Microsoft Teams typically, but about 22% of our learning support had been provided by phone. And so I'm interested in digging into that, because we have seen more during COVID-19 this digital divide, students who do not have reliable access to a computer, to an internet connection. So I was interested to see that almost a quarter of our learning support had been provided by phone.
Look, I'm going to have to close it off because we're already 4 minutes over the allotted time. Thank you both for a most illuminative and enjoyable presentation. And thank you for the number of people that stayed online after the 2 o'clock finish. And can I invite people to come with us to Adelaide for our next one in a couple of weeks' time. So keep well, keep safe, and thanks for attending. Bye.